What are the priorities for the human rights agenda in the Middle East? Can the impunity of human rights violators be replaced with accountability? And if so, how? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Leah Whitson. Leah Whitson is the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. Previously, she served as the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division for 15 years. Whitson has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, accountability, legal reform, migrant workers, and human rights. She's published and commented widely on human rights and foreign policy in the Middle East for leading international and regional media. Whitson is a graduate of Harvard Law School and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Leah Whitson, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections. You're muted.
It's great to see you after so many years, Mouin.
Likewise. So let's head straight into our discussion. As you know, the Middle East is a large and in many ways also a diverse region with different political and socioeconomic systems, different levels of sovereignty, development, and stability, and different levels of integration with the global economy. These realities notwithstanding, is it possible to identify priorities for the human rights agenda that are common throughout the region, or at least most of it?
I think there are a few factors that we would say they're shared in common, and that is, number one, the absence of democracy, the absence of civil and political rights that allow for true exercise of democratic representative forms of government. The leading feature of that, of course, is the criminalization of speech under various guises, under insult and slander laws, under deeming them threats to national security, sometimes even labeled as terrorism, the mere expression of political speech.
So it goes far beyond lèse-majesté.
Oh, it sadly goes far beyond lèse-majesté, and in fact, it goes to say things as vague as harming brotherly relations, or insulting the judiciary, or insulting the institutions of the state, expressing cynicism towards the government, which is actually a charge, a real charge against Salman al-Aude, leading religious theologian and reformer in Saudi Arabia, who is facing charges that could lead to the death penalty for charges that include expressing cynicism towards the rulers. But going back to the question, I digressed. I think that is profoundly lacking, a profoundly common theme. And then, of course, the other major crisis for many countries in the Middle East, but not all, is the military conflicts, the wars, the armed conflicts happening on the ground in so many countries in the region that is affecting so many countries in the region, and that has been so horribly devastating. It's hard to think about civil and political rights when entire cities and neighborhoods are still being reduced to rubble in so many parts of the Middle East. And the breakdown of the state and the state authority to protect its citizens, to deliver goods and services, jobs, security to its citizens is another massive human rights priority, although it's rarely reflected as such in traditional human rights parlance.
I'd like to return to your initial comment about the absence of civil and political rights. When we think of, let's say, more conventional human rights violations like false imprisonment, torture, deprivation of basic rights, do you see kind of an organic connection between the absence of these civil and political rights and, let's call them, for lack of a better term, these more violent assaults on individuals and communities?
Well, absolutely, because the expression of civil and political rights is the most important form of accountability. It is how we keep governments in check. It is how we condemn and criticize and lobby and advocate to change the symptoms of autocracies, the symptoms of authoritarian regimes, which is the violence against populations under their control, whether they're the carceral population, people who are tortured, starved, humiliated, raped inside prisons, or whether it's the physical and violence randomly inflicted on citizens who come to a stop in the road and offend a police officer or deemed to, or just people who live in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the government can use violence and violent means against them, such as we're seeing in Saudi Arabia right now, where communities are being forcibly displaced in order to build this fantasy city of Mouin. I think all of those are symptoms of governments that are unelected, undemocratic, unaccountable to their citizenry. I think if you can fix that, most of these symptomatic problems, which are about abuse of power, abuse of the use of force, abuse of the monopoly of
impunity, in a word.
Impunity, but also accountability in the broader sense. Impunity, you think of punishing a wrongdoer. Accountability means demanding systemic changes, demanding systemic reforms, demanding legislative changes and overhauls to prohibit and prevent abuses.
And that would include things like civilian control over the military and security forces and so on, I presume.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd now like to return to the issue you raised about armed conflicts. If we focus on countries in the region that are consumed by armed conflicts or prolonged occupation, such as Iraq, Libya, Palestine, Western Sahara, Syria, and Yemen, the list seems to get longer with every passing year. We often think of issues like war crimes and denial of self-determination. And important as these issues are, it also seems that economic warfare in the form of siege and sanctions has become integral to these situations, Gaza and Yemen being two clear examples. How, in your view, do such issues fit into the broader picture of the struggle for human rights?
We at Dawn, and I personally do see sanctions, countrywide, extensive sanctions, such as those applied by the United States to over 35 countries around the world.
Many of them in the Middle East.
Many of them in the Middle East as a tool of warfare. They are a form of economic warfare that can cause far more fatal harm to civilians than even the dropping of bombs on towns and villages. And I think we've seen that in Yemen. We saw it in Iraq during the lead up to the Gulf War in 2003. We've seen it certainly in Iran, where the economic sanctions have had such a crippling effect on the economy, but in particular, access to health, access to medicine. So it is definitely a tool of warfare that is expanding and growing. And it's also for that reason that I'm particularly troubled and wary about the massive sanctions that are being applied, not only to the Russian government in Ukraine, but to Russian citizens because of alleged links to the government. The fact that these sanctions are being applied is so quickly, so without any apparent deliberation, clearly without any evidence that we've been able to see as civil society, makes me very nervous that they are being abused and misused.
But a very blunt instrument.
It's a blunt instrument. It's an instrument that flies under the radar. And it's an instrument that the US government in particular is addicted to. It is addicted to trying to squeeze a civilian population in order to extract political concessions from a government. That's just not right.
Well, those who would disagree with you would say that they view economic warfare, they would call them targeted sanctions or whatever, as an alternative to armed warfare and the dropping of bombs and so on. But indeed, if one looks at how things have developed in the Middle East in recent decades, they more often than not seem to be a precursor to military conflict.
A precursor or a postcursor.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to clarify, targeted sanctions is a bit of a myth. I mean, the only kind of sanctions that I would support, and in fact, Dawn has advocated for, are individual sanctions targeting individual wrongdoers, individual abusers. But sanctions that go beyond, that apply to entire industries, that apply to entire states, that apply to entire economic sectors, those are not targeted. Those are deliberately intended to impact a country's economy, to squeeze the civilian population on this absurd notion that they will therefore rise up and protest to remove their government. The facts show it doesn't actually work. It doesn't lead to those outcomes. And the facts also show that the governments are not impacted. They can ride the sanctions for very long periods of time. And yet it is the civilians who suffer.
And how would you respond to those who would argue that those who you say should be targeted are not, let's say, CEOs of a company where you can seize their bank accounts and stock options, but they in fact often have personal control, not only over the machinery of state, but over very significant sectors of the economy as well?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So you can apply individual sanctions against individual wrongdoers, provided there is due process, provided there is actual evidence to support the allegations that this person is an abuser. The primary means for that are treasury sanctions, so Magnitsky sanctions, which result basically in a travel ban and a freeze of assets. It tends to discourage anyone else in the international community from transacting with that person as well. That's sort of the secondary teeth of these sanctions, which intend to have more importance, in fact. But countrywide sanctions are different.
If we turn now to the region and the upheaval it's been undergoing, the Arab world, as you know, has been in upheaval for over a decade. And the initial promise of constitutional government, civilian control, and rule of law, the issues which you raised earlier, have been largely displaced by mass imprisonment, autocracy, and rule by decree, most notably in Egypt, but now also engulfing Tunisia. I'd of course like to hear your views on these realities, but I'm particularly interested in how human rights defenders are able to continue their work under such challenging circumstances. Can their efforts to make a difference, can they succeed where, as you pointed out, governments have not only demonized, but often criminalized human rights defenders?
Again, I mean, just in terms of the second part of your question, which is clearer to me, indeed, the space for civil society, to domestic civil society that has not fled the country, to express its views, to act as checks on their government, to expose wrongdoing by their governments, that has nearly disappeared. There are very, very, very few places left in the Middle East and North Africa where citizens can act as watchdogs, where citizens can challenge their governments, demand reform, demand change without facing personal risk to themselves, but also quite tragically to their families, to their extended families, to their cousins and uncles, nieces and nephews. And so that is a big tragedy for the region, because it is, really the evisceration of what we need for any democratic society to thrive. We need an engaged citizenry that believes it is its role to hold its government accountable and to participate meaningfully in government. So it's not only bad for now, it decapitates, incapacitates future generations from building experience acting as civil society. I think there is virtually no space in Egypt left anymore. We read every week, every month, every other month about yet another journalist or human rights activist, even a mere academic, like the economist who died in Egyptian custody this week after having been disappeared by the government for what appears to be absolutely no reason at all, it makes it impossible for anyone to lift their heads and speak out. You know, it is a terror state. Mada Masr, which is a news outlet that does the best investigative journalism in Egypt, is one of the few strands left. The Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights is an amazing organization, but is able to do, in fact, very little publicly. The Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies has gone into exile.
And these are organizations with a long pedigree in Egypt.
They are organizations with a long pedigree in Egypt, women's organizations, feminist organizations. They have either been shuttered or their staff imprisoned, and it's a very bleak situation. And this is what's now happening underway in Tunisia, when parliamentarians are being arrested, when civil society activists are facing threats, are being hounded and pursued and arrested. And I am certain that unless there's some kind of intervention in Tunisia to reverse the course of events, it will get worse. It will get worse, just as in recent days, we saw what happened to people who were attempting to protest the parliament's effort to reestablish itself in the country. Even in countries like Jordan, which have generally a reputation of being a softer place, which takes a gentler hand towards its citizens, this past month, the government has completely lost its marbles. It has resorted to what it's calling, without apparent embarrassment, preemptive arrests. It's the most Kafkaesque a project of over 200 civil society citizenry who've been arrested because the government suspected that they were planning on going to a protest to raise teacher salaries, a protest to commemorate the killing of a protester in 2011, a protest for the unemployed movement. You know, wherever protests are popping up, and they are popping up across the country in Jordan, the government's new strategy is to preemptively jail its citizens. It's insane. But this is the license that Jordan believes it has from its prime benefactor, the United States, and from its other benefactors, so the axis of authoritarians, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who continue to have Jordan on a very short leash and feel very comfortable yanking on it whenever they want.
And of course, when we talk about these kinds of repressive activities, there are, let's say, the judicial and extrajudicial suppression of civil society and human rights organizations. And I think a particularly notable example is several months ago, the Israeli designation of 6 human rights and civic organizations as terrorist organizations.
Yes, and that is a designation which no other government in the world has supported or endorsed, because the Israeli government provided absolutely no evidence to support this designation to all of the governments it trotted out to lobby to support its designation. We at Dawn were, I think, among the first to condemn this designation and to organize a congressional staff briefing by the heads of these 6 Palestinian organizations. I've just returned from Ramallah, where I was able to meet with the heads of several of these organizations and to further our coordination and collaboration together, and to publicly support these organizations and show our solidarity with them. The efforts to quash civil society don't just happen with a naked brute force of massacres such as we've seen in Egypt. They also happen with legal shenanigans of governments like Israel, which not only are attempting to quash Palestinian civil society, are also attempting to isolate Palestinian civil society, particularly in Gaza. That's why they have made it not only impossible to get out of Gaza, but they've made it nearly impossible for international community to go into Gaza. They're trying to do the same thing for the West Bank, cut off Palestinian civil society from its engagement with the international community, punish Palestinians who attempt to bring legal actions and support the legal action at the International Criminal Court. And of course, massive spying on Palestinian civil society. You know, as we know now, Israel was first using its Pegasus NSO group spyware on Palestinians and Palestinian human rights activists.
And Israelis, it seems, as well.
And Israelis. Apparently, even Bibi and his staff were not safe.
Right. And this seems to be one case, and there are others in the region, of basically repression in the service of perpetuating impunity and the lack of accountability.
That's right.
So if we turn now to the US, the organization you lead, Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, is very much focused on US policy towards the Arab world and its impact on human rights. I'd first like to ask your response to the widespread accusations in the Middle East that Washington's policy towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine is above all an exercise in hypocrisy, not on account of support for Russia's actions, but rather because Washington has for decades enthusiastically supported similar behavior by Israel, has for 7 years been directly assisting the catastrophic destruction of Yemen, conducted a virtually identical invasion of Iraq in 2003, and a few years ago razed the Syrian city of Raqqa to the ground. The recently deceased Madeleine Albright, who as Secretary of State publicly stated that 500,000 dead Iraqi children was a price worth paying to weaken the Iraqi government, for many personifies the absence of US credibility in the region when it comes to human rights. To the extent that you accept that these are the realities and constraints within which your organization operates, isn't the effort to integrate a human rights agenda into US Middle East policy a fool's errand?
Well, let me address the different parts of your question and hopefully will lead to the answer on that last piece of it. Just to start, I don't think the issue of Ukraine or America's approach to Ukraine is not just a problem of hypocrisy and double standards. You know, if only it was only a problem of hypocrisy and double standards. I've just written on this recently, and the argument that I'm trying to make, and I think I'm right, is that this is now a self-defeating strategy. America's approach to the Middle East and North Africa, its support for autocratic, undemocratic governments that massacre their populations, its support for governments that ignore international law and acquire territory by force, its support for governments that carry out war crimes with abandon, and not only does it support them, it actively participates in their fighting, such as in Yemen. This behavior by the US as the most important global player in the world has eroded and undermined the very international laws and norms that the US is now desperately clinging to in order to vindicate its campaign against Russia in Ukraine. And the reason why there have been so few in the international community that have supported America's campaign against Russia because of its illegal invasion of Ukraine is because the United States has undermined these international laws and norms to such an extent that no one believes in them anymore. It's not a cafeteria that you can pull out international norms and laws when you feel like it, when it suits your interests, when you're trampling on them and everywhere else. Take the International Criminal Court, for example. The US has spent over the last decade trampling the court, sanctioning the prosecutor, sanctioning the staff of the prosecutor, sanctioning the family members of the prosecutor and her staff because they dared to investigate Israel and they dared to investigate CIA abuses in Afghanistan. The United States has repeatedly condemned the International Criminal Court as a biased institution.
And is not a member.
And is not a member. Though it votes to refer Syria and Sudan to the Security Council and Libya to the Security Council. And now it wants the whole world to support an ICC investigation of Russian crimes in Yemen. Well, the court has been eviscerated by America's attacks. Those very institutions that, guess what, even the US needs to turn to in a time of the breakdown of global order, it has eroded. And so this is a dilemma that the United States has to grapple with. And on the other side, the United States hasn't even gotten the benefit of the bargain. The US has justified its efforts to quash international laws and norms on the basis of the argument that this is what serves the interests of its supposed allies and partners in the Middle East. So recognize illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, look away from the apartheid on the ground, recognize the illegal annexation of Western Sahara, look away from massive bombardment, massive criminal siege of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in exchange for what's supposed to be US hegemony, US primacy, US control over these puppet regimes. But guess what? We haven't even gotten the benefit of the bargain. They are snubbing the United States, and the access that the United States paid for, that US taxpayers paid for via the Abraham Accords, that American government officials paid generous political capital for, that little Abraham axis of authoritarians is now acting in concert against the United States, refusing to sanction Russia, refusing to increase oil output, setting its own terms and demands as an independent bloc, so to speak. So the United States has created a Frankenstein. It's paid richly, richly for that Frankenstein, and it has not gotten even the benefit of the bargain that it set out to justify its hypocritical behavior for.
And turning again to the article you published in Foreign Policy in January, you wrote, and here I'm quoting, advocacy organizations can't protect human rights without challenging US military support for tyrants and the corrupt influence of the defense industry and foreign governments. So it kind of works on both sides of the equation. You're addressing not only government policies, but also the agenda of the human rights community.
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think that what I was trying to address and what I'll address to your audience today is that we in the foreign policy advocacy community, the human rights advocacy community, whatever advocacy community that's wedded to international law, rules, norms, democracy, we cannot continue to pursue a strategy that advocates for the US government to quote unquote prioritize human rights, ceding the space to the so-called security interests and national security interests that our government cites to justify ignoring human rights abuses of its so-called partners in the Middle East. That's a failed strategy because up against what the government is asserting are national security interests, the human rights interests of people far away will always be the runner-up. It will always be the loser ahead of Americans' own national security interests. What we have to challenge is these asserted national security interests because they're fake, they're not real, they don't serve the interests of even the American people. And the people who are claiming to represent the interests of the American people, our elected officials, are compromised and conflicted and beholden to foreign government lobbyists and defense industry lobbyists. If we don't tackle this control of our government, none of our advocacy about abuses far away over there are going to add up to much.
Well, turning now to the question of lobbyists that you just raised, as part of its focus on US Middle East policy, your organization has also sought to expose the role of lobbyists in this equation. So can you give us an indication of the role such firms play besides submitting obscenely expensive invoices to their clients, and what changes your organization is seeking to achieve in this respect?
Sure. These lobbyists, these lobbying firms, are often quite frequently former US government officials themselves. So they trade on their access, their connections, their know-how while they were in government, serving, for example, as a chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the House Appropriations Committee and so forth, to sell that influence and access to foreign governments or to the defense industry. They arranged dozens, if not hundreds, if not many, many hundreds of meetings to advocate for the interests of their clients, which in the case of foreign governments and defense industry is almost always about weapons and more weapons and more weapons. They do this by misrepresenting the government's record. They do it by whitewashing the government's abuses in order to quell any protest or resistance to arming abusive governments. And they do it with campaign finance contributions that they coordinate, orchestrate, and organize on behalf of their lobbying firm to basically grease the wheels of their access. It's a rather naked pay-to-play scheme. And obviously the issue of lobbyists and campaign finance reform is much broader than just the defense industry and foreign government lobbyists. But these two affect the security of Americans and the security of people in the Middle East more than any other lobbyists. We want to see significant reform in the way that the lobbying businesses operate. We want them to respect their human rights obligations and refuse to represent abusive governments as a matter of self-regulation, as a matter of self-compliance. We want our own government to ban doing business with as lobbyists for abusive governments. And we want government officials to pledge not to meet with lobbyists for abusive governments. And we also want to ban government officials going to work for foreign governments or defense industry lobbyists after their term of service. We need to cut these financial ties, these financial incentives that skew the judgment, that skew the interests of our elected officials.
Well, some would say that's all well and good, but even if the entire lobbying industry disappeared between now and tomorrow morning, I'd refer to your detailed response to my previous question, where you basically indicated the preponderant self-defined national security interests of the United States. And it's not as if the government is being persuaded into courses of actions it otherwise wouldn't adopt. So, you know, your points about the lobbyists are all very well taken, but couldn't one also argue that their activities are basically of marginal significance in the larger scheme of things?
No, I don't think so. I think they certainly feed into ideologies of hegemony, ideologies of control, US primacy that many elected officials come to their roles in and come with a mission of protecting and maintaining hegemony and control. But I think that the immediate damage of the arms dump to the Middle East is something that is directly facilitated and encouraged by the foreign government and defense industry lobbyists.
So they play a significant reinforcing role.
Well, I think it's more than a reinforcing role. I think they play a leadership role in advocating for massive arms sales to countries that would not otherwise be enjoying military support. You know, for example, keep in mind, President Biden pledged to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. He pledged to, quote unquote, end the blank check to General Sisi in Egypt. All of those pledges were overridden, not because they served America's interests, but because they were intensely lobbied and bullied and threatened by the foreign governments and their lobbyists, by the defense industry and their lobbyists.
I'd now like to return to or proceed to an issue that's at the very heart of your organization. Dawn is the brainchild of Saudi journalist and commentator Jamal Khashoggi, who was brutally murdered by agents of the Saudi state in Istanbul in 2018. Almost 4 years later, the initial hopes for justice and accountability appear to have recently suffered a significant blow, with Turkey essentially choosing to let the state that killed him take control of the case. And if I'm not mistaken, they've basically said that it should be Saudi prosecutors who deal with this issue moving forward. So where do things currently stand with respect to that case? And what developments do you expect in the coming period?
Well, in terms of the Turkish prosecution of many of the individuals implicated in the murder of Khashoggi in Istanbul, we anticipated that the Turkish government was going to wind this trial down.
So it didn't come as a surprise.
No, not at all. I mean, there were remarks made by Ibrahim Kalin last year suggesting that they were looking to unload this trial and find a way out of it. Making allusions to a course of justice in Saudi Arabia, etc. I think they were just figuring out the most face-saving way to do it. And of course, it didn't work in any event. But it is part and parcel of the Turkish government's efforts at rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that has been put on warp speed given the catastrophe of the Turkish economy and the collapse of the lira. I think the Emirati government single-handedly saved the Turkish economy last December when Mohammed bin Zayed showed up with over $10 billion infusion into the Turkish economy, as well as pledges for further investment.
There's a whole new definition to blood money.
Oh man, yeah. And in February, Erdogan went to the UAE. He was also supposed to go to Riyadh at that time. It was announced he was meant to go to Riyadh. And the reason he didn't go to Riyadh is because the Saudi government was not interested in meeting with him until they wrapped this trial up. Now that's done, I expect an imminent visit to Saudi Arabia to shore up more financial support for the Turkish economy. However, this is not the last trial for the murder of Jamal. Our organization, along with Khadija Cengiz, has also a case filed against Mohammed bin Salman himself, as well as his co-conspirators in U.S. federal district court. And Mohammed has filed a motion to dismiss our case, citing
sovereign immunity, I presume.
Well, he's trying to cite it, but of course the State Department has not made a suggestion of immunity to the court. Both the Trump administration and so far the Biden administration have declined to intervene with a suggestion of immunity, which MBS's lawyers formally made in another litigation pending against him by Saad Jabri for the attempted murder of Saad Jabri.
This is the former senior Saudi intelligence officer.
That's right.
Who I believe is now in Canada.
That's right. He has a pending lawsuit in federal district court in the United States for that plot to murder him. So we hope we'll win the motion. We hope our case will continue. We hope we will move into discovery and that discovery will serve as the most important tool for establishing a judicial record of the crime that took place on October 3rd, 2018, and the role of Mohammed Salman in ordering the murder and orchestrating the murder.
Well, and I think that's an unfortunately present segue to my final question, which is that, as this case I think clearly shows, human rights violations are often ultimately the product of either impunity or a lack of accountability. And is there, in your view, a realistic pathway to addressing these challenges in a meaningful way?
Well, I don't know what realistic means and in what context. We are up against unbelievable odds. We are playing out a David versus Goliath in 2022 against unprecedented concentrations of power that are transnational. There is a transnational alliance of authoritarians with more surveillance technology, more weaponry, more brute force than we've really ever seen before in this kind of a combination. But, what's possible remains in the hands of human beings. And these are not laws of nature. These are individuals who are choosing to be tyrants, supported by individuals who choose to support these tyrants in my country. I think these approaches can be changed because, for example, we can advocate in the United States, at least, to end America's support for abusive apartheid governments in the Middle East. I hope that that will encourage the citizenry in the Arab world to find opportunities by weakened states, by weakened leadership in their own countries. But it's also, if there is any natural law here, I think the natural law is being gone against in the suppression of human freedom, in the suppression of human dignity, in the suppression of human free will. These governments, these authoritarians are always going to be playing whack-a-mole. It reminds me of the Chinese government going around in loudspeakers telling the people of Shanghai to quell their instinct for freedom, not to resist the lockdown, and basically the Arab tyrants, the Middle East tyrants, have to put it on constant loop because they are always up against the urge for freedom, the spirit of the need for freedom among living, breathing human beings.
Well, by realistic, I meant effective, and I think you gave a very clear answer to that, that it always begins with individuals and organizations committed to freedom, not least those such as your own. Sarah Leah Whitson, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. Our next episode will be on April 26th on the never-ending saga of Palestinian textbooks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.